On days like today, when Cardano is differentiating itself from the rest of the crypto space so strongly, you know what I'm talking about, I reflect on what it is that's so special about Cardano. I think it's that the Cardano ethos is the opposite of the Silicon Valley mindset. Ready? Let's go. In recent days, we've looked at some very specific ways in which Cardano is very different from some of its near competitors. We've looked at things like initial token distributions and engagement with science, but I think it's really a bigger thing. I think Cardano is different because it has a completely different mindset, a different ethos, a different way of thinking. I think this goes all the way back to the start of Cardano, all the way back to the beginning. What was the beginning of Cardano? Well, if you go to cardano.org, there's a page on the website that tells the whole story. Cardano started with an initial coin offering between October 2015 and January 2017, or thereabouts. In that ICO, the Cardano Foundation, Emergo, and IOHK got 20%. The other 25 billion ADA were sold to the public in 4 tranches. And this all happened in Asia. Here's all 4 tranches. You can see tranche 1 was 100% Japan. Tranche 2 was 99.9% Japan with a few South Korean and Malaysian investors. Tranche 3 was 92.9% Japan with some other ADA just sort of distributed around Asia. Tranche 4 was 92% Japan, again, with some other ADA sort of distributed around Asia. That's it. That's the beginning of Cardano. That's how it all started. Do you notice what's missing here? That's right, Silicon Valley. This little spot in the Bay Area that's home to all these companies: Adobe, Alphabet, Apple, Cisco, eBay, EA, Facebook, HP, Intel, Netflix, PayPal, Twitter, Oracle. We could just go on and on forever. It's every tech company you've ever heard of. And those are just the companies that are based in this tiny bit of the Bay Area that Wikipedia tells us has the 3rd highest GDP per capita in the world. But Silicon Valley's influence isn't restricted to its gilded geographic boundaries. Venture capital firms based in Silicon Valley and elsewhere have spread Silicon Valley culture to tech companies all over the globe. It's no surprise that this has included many of Cardano's Generation 3 blockchain competitors. Solana here, who we've talked about in recent days, if you go to their Crunchbase profile, it shows the recent $314 million raise that was anchored by Andreessen Horowitz of Menlo Park and Polychain of San Francisco. You might know Andreessen Horowitz better by the name A16Z, which I've heard explained by members of their firm as being necessary because they knew everyone was going to screw up the 16 letters between the A and the Z in Andreessen Horowitz, mainly because of the 3 E's in Mark Andreessen's name. Likewise with Algorand, we see venture rounds, seed rounds, but the VC firms have a distinctly more East Coast flavor because of Algorand being based so much around MIT and Boston. For Polkadot, Crunchbase also shows venture and seed rounds, and we see the same types of organizations. Someone asked me about Terra recently. What we find is that even when we travel to Seoul, which is an awesome city to visit, where Crunchbase says Terra is based, we find these kinds of organizations. Menlo Park, San Francisco, and our favorite, Mike Novogratz, adding a little bit of a East Coast flair to this list of VC firms. Of course, venture capital is not inherently a bad thing. And in the tech startup world, venture raises are celebrated more than almost anything else. And venture capital certainly played a huge hand in the development of companies like these. But if you look at these companies, Alphabet, Apple, eBay, Facebook, PayPal, Twitter, Netflix, what they all have in common these days, besides making their founders incredible, unbelievable amounts of money, what they all seem to have in common in today's commentary on these kinds of companies are words like planned obsolescence, addiction, manipulation. And if you think about it, it's hard to argue that this isn't how Google and Facebook and Twitter keep you on their platforms. Those kinds of words are really how Apple keeps you buying their products. You can say great things about all these companies. I think they all deliver great things to their consumers as well, but they do seem to have in common a certain way of looking at their customers. The customer is something to be manipulated. Of course, we all watch YouTube, we all use Twitter, our parents all use Facebook, and they're certainly delivering products and services to the consumer that the consumer wants. There's demand for these products and services for sure, but when you dig in and you understand how they keep you on the platform, how they keep you captive to their products, it's hard not to say that there's a certain ethos of manipulation of the consumer. We are using that term very broadly. You could also say that pretty much any type of advertisement, even back in the 1980s, a car ad on television, the whole purpose of advertising is to manipulate the consumer into buying your product, especially consumers who maybe wouldn't buy your product. That's the whole point of advertising. So yes, manipulation of consumers is the whole goal when you're trying to achieve consumer adoption. But I think we can also agree it's different with these big tech companies. You didn't really hear parents in the 1980s really worried about how much time their kids were spending playing with He-Man or G.I. Joe or Barbie figurines. But you do hear parents extremely concerned about how much screen time their kids are getting these days on platforms created by these companies. The other day, when we looked at Messari's report on the initial token allocations of some of Cardano's Gen 3 competitors, I couldn't help but have that same feeling I get when I read articles about the various ways in which big tech companies keep users on their platforms. Of course, it's all a matter of degrees and line drawing, but if you ask me who cares more about the insiders and who cares more about their users, I think these kind of graphs do tell a story. Similarly, when I look at certain design decisions of some of Cardano's competitors, I can't help but think that they're more on the same wavelength as those big tech companies than they are on the same wavelength of like Cardano or Ethereum or Bitcoin. In the comments to one of the recent days videos, Gillian provided a link to this very interesting thread in Reddit from user "Today's my cheat day." And I'll be the first one to say, I don't follow Polkadot closely enough to know how accurate this post is. I just don't know that much about Polkadot compared to how closely I follow Cardano. But this is a very interesting list of comparisons of different design decisions that Cardano has made and Polkadot has made. I can't vouch for the accuracy of any of this, but it does remind me of what we've looked at in previous days in terms of other of Cardano's Gen 3 competitors relying on the architecture that Ethereum put in place And then we're sort of left wondering, okay, they put this architecture in place that came from somewhere else, which isn't a bad idea. It's good to build on what others have built, but then you have to wonder, do they know how to integrate that into their system, given whatever little or big changes their system would impose on that. Obviously there are big differences between Polkadot and Cardano, and probably incorporating, whatever pieces of Ouroboros Praus they may have taken, incorporating that in their system probably means some pretty big changes. And we know that a guy like Gavin Wood is a very capable and good blockchain developer. But this does kind of all ring of the venture-backed big tech perspective on the world. I mean, VCs are always trying to make an exit. So if you think about a crypto platform that's venture-backed, let's rewind a couple years. Say we go back a couple years, and they they and their venture VC backers, one of the things they care about is getting to market. They have to get to market, right? So they can make their exit. And one way they could do that is, the way Cardano did it, just slowly build from scratch and take, 5-6 years. Or they could just borrow an architecture from somewhere else, like Ouroboros Praus or Casper from Ethereum. They could sort of install that in their system and try to work out the bugs, the kinks later. And it seems like we're seeing hints of that. We're seeing hints of some of these more VC backed blockchains doing things like that, because those VCs, they want to get to market and they want to make an exit. And a quick way to do that would be borrowing architecture from other blockchains, and then, getting that in place as quickly as possible, and then worrying about the problems later. It's like, is this going to cause problems down the road? Who cares? Let's just get to proof of stake as quickly as possible. This kind of reminds me of, is this going to create problems for consumers if we figure out ways to manipulate them into staying on our platforms as many hours as possible out of the day? Who cares? Let's just get the adoption. We didn't see this in Cardano. We didn't see venture rounds aimed at VC firms. We saw an ICO that took place in Asia, and this led to a different landscape in which Cardano got to operate. It was a different genesis event. A different distribution of tokens led to the project having different masters. You could argue that with a lot of Cardano's competitors, the people building the project had various masters. Those included venture capitalists and the public to whom they sold tokens, venture capitalists and other investors. In Cardano's case, it was largely just the public. I mean, we have it right here. 20% of the tokens went to the founding entities. The other 80% went to the public. And, I'm sure there were entities that snuck in here, but this was just a public sale. And, I'm sure, they did KYC, and there was a lot of auditing. So they know exactly who the investors were, but it was a public sale. It wasn't a venture round aimed at VCs. So Cardano, when they were having those meetings where they decided how to build out the project, they never had to include the Galaxy Digitals of the world. They never had to include the Alamedas of the world. They never had to include the Coinbase Ventures of the world. They could make the decision that they thought was the best decision for the stakeholders, 80% of which were the public, 20% of which were the three founding entities. There was no Mike Novogratz sitting at the table to make a suggestion, and this is a fictional event, I'm not saying this actually happened, but there's no Mike Novogratz type character sitting there who would say, hey, Cardano, you should just adopt Casper. You should just go with Casper, and then you won't have to build out Ouroboros. You could just use Casper, and you'll get to market years faster, which will allow me, the VC, to make a much faster exit. That person was never at the table when it came to Cardano, And I think that's a big part of why things have unfolded the way they have, and why on a day like today, we see Cardano behaving so differently than a lot of its competitors. Talk to you tomorrow.